Picture two ancient humans sitting together at the edge of a fire, somewhere in Europe, roughly 30,000 years ago. They sit close in the way people who know each other deeply sit close, the kind of proximity that isn't accidental, that gets chosen and maintained through 100 small daily decisions. Where to sit, who to walk beside, whose company to seek when the group settles in for the night. They've each been alive for maybe 25 years. They've survived winters that killed people around them. They've hunted together, traveled together, carried each other through the brutal physical and social demands of Ice Age life. And they are both men. Here's the question this video is going to take seriously, carefully, and without flinching. Was that relationship, or relationships like it, ever sexual? Did ancient humans, in the hundreds of thousands of years before civilization, before written law, before organized religion, before any of the cultural frameworks that later shaped how humanity thinks about sexuality, actually experience and act on same-sex attraction? This question gets asked with real political urgency today, usually inside arguments about whether homosexuality is natural or unnatural, ancient or modern, something built into human biology or something manufactured by contemporary culture. The honest, evidence-based answer requires doing something modern debate usually skips, separating biology from culture, the universal from the specific, and the question of what ancient humans did from the question of what they called it. Those are genuinely different questions, and both have fascinating answers. Let's start with biology, because that's where the ground is most solid. Same-sex sexual behavior isn't rare in the animal kingdom. It's documented in over 1,500 species, from insects to birds to mammals, across nearly every major lineage that's been carefully studied. Bonobos, one of our two closest living relatives, sharing roughly 98.7% of our DNA, engage in same-sex behavior constantly and enthusiastically, in both males and females, in ways that clearly serve social bonding as much as reproduction. Dolphins, giraffes, elephants, penguins, sheep, the list of species with documented same-sex behavior is long, diverse, and it keeps growing with every decade of research. This matters for the ancient human question because it sets a baseline. Same-sex behavior is not a human invention, not a cultural glitch, not a byproduct of modern life. It's a feature of animal sexuality that predates our species by hundreds of millions of years. The genetics point the same direction. Researchers have identified multiple genetic variants linked to same-sex sexual behavior, spread across several chromosomes. These aren't rare mutations. They're common variants sitting in the human gene pool at meaningful frequencies, and they show up across global populations that had no historical contact with each other. Variants that persist across separated populations for thousands of generations are old variants. They were in ancient populations because they're in every population descended from them. The largest genome-wide study on this, published in Science in 2019 and covering nearly 500,000 people, found that same-sex behavior is shaped by many genetic variants, each with a small individual effect. There's no single gay gene. There's a whole polygenic architecture, many small effect variants working together, and that kind of architecture is exactly what you'd expect from a trait that's been sitting in the human genome for a very long time, shaped by complex, competing selection pressures. So the capacity for same-sex attraction is ancient. What's not ancient is the way we categorize it. The idea of homosexuality as a fixed identity, the notion that there's a distinct kind of person defined by attraction to the same sex, is a historically specific invention. It took its modern shape in the 19th century, inside a very particular set of European medical and intellectual frameworks. That doesn't mean same-sex behavior didn't exist before then. It means the identity framework we use to organize it didn't exist yet. Ancient humans almost certainly had no concept of homosexuality as a personal identity, and no concept of heterosexuality either. Sorting sexuality into categories like gay, straight, and bisexual is a cultural technology and a fairly recent one. What ancient humans had was the raw material, attraction, desire, the full range of human sexual responsiveness expressed through whatever framework their community had built. So what were those frameworks? This is where things get harder and where honesty matters. Direct archaeological evidence for same-sex relationships before writing is extremely thin, not because it didn't happen, but because relationships and desire leave almost no physical trace. A burial tells you who was laid where, with what, next to whom. It doesn't tell you who that person loved. What we do have is indirect evidence, and it points consistently in one direction. The first is what anthropologists call the universality argument. Across hundreds of documented human societies, spanning every continent and every level of technological development, not one has been found to entirely lack same-sex behavior among its members. Some societies tried to suppress it, some celebrated it. Most landed somewhere in between, but it has shown up everywhere humans have shown up, which is exactly what you'd expect from a trait with deep genetic roots. It appears wherever humans appear because it is part of what humans are. The second line of evidence is the earliest written record, sources that arrive after the purely ancient period we're discussing, but that reveal the cultural frameworks ancient humans' direct descendants had already built. The oldest legal codes, myths, and literature from Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China all treat same-sex behavior as a recognized, if variously judged, feature of life. The Code of Hammurabi contains provisions some scholars read as addressing same-sex relationships. Egyptian texts reference same-sex behavior without apparent condemnation. India's oldest texts, including the Rig Veda and the Kama Sutra, acknowledge same-sex desire outright. Early Chinese literature references same-sex love as well. These civilizations weren't uniformly accepting. Attitudes varied, and some were openly hostile. But the moment any of them started writing, same-sex behavior was already there, an established fact of life. It was never new. It was never introduced. Now, let's talk about something the archaeological record does give us more directly: gender diversity and the social roles built around it, which in many traditional cultures connect straight to same-sex sexuality. Across a striking range of traditional societies, anthropologists have documented recognized roles for people whose gender didn't fit the male-female binary. Different cultures gave them different names: Tuezo in various indigenous North American traditions, Hizra in South Asia, Fafine in Samoa, Mux in Zapotec culture, Sakrata in Madagascar. These roles share structural features. They're formally recognized, they carry specific social or ritual functions, and they frequently include same-sex relationships as an ordinary, unremarkable part of the role. Finding this pattern independently on multiple continents, in societies with zero historical contact, suggests it isn't a coincidence. It's a response to something consistent in human biology and psychology. There's also a burial from the Czech Republic, dating back roughly 5,000 years, later than the purely ancient period, but still, before complex civilization, identified as a biological male buried in the position, and with the goods, normally reserved for women in that culture. Older examples are harder to interpret with confidence, since the biological sex of ancient remains, and the meaning of old burial goods, aren't always easy to establish. But the consistency of gender-diverse roles across traditional cultures, paired with early burials like this one, suggests gender diversity, and the same-sex relationships often tied to it go back a long way into the ancient period. There's also the neuroscience. Sexual orientation appears to be largely set before birth, through a mix of genetics and the prenatal hormonal environment. Take the fraternal birth order effect. Each additional older brother a boy has raises his odds of being gay by roughly 33%, likely through a maternal immune response that shapes fetal brain development. That's a mechanism operating entirely before birth, with essentially zero cultural input, and it would have been operating in ancient wombs exactly as it operates in wombs today. Ancient genetic variants, ancient prenatal biology, ancient developmental mechanisms, all producing same-sex attraction in ancient populations at rates almost certainly close to what we see now. Somewhere around 2 to 10% of the population, depending on how you define and measure it. Here's a reframe worth sitting with. Asking whether ancient humans practiced homosexuality quietly assumes same-sex attraction is something separate from normal human sexuality. Optional, like a feature that might not have been installed. The evidence says otherwise. It isn't a deviation from normal human sexuality. It is a feature of normal human sexuality, produced by common, ancient, biological mechanisms, present in every population ever studied. Ancient humans weren't an exception to this pattern. They were its origin. We didn't develop same-sex attraction after the ancient world. We inherited it from the ancient world. So, how would ancient communities have responded to it? We can reasonably infer this from social structure. Hunter-gatherer bands were small, typically 15 to 50 people, everyone known intimately by everyone else. What we see in surviving traditional societies is a strong ethic of tolerating individual differences, paired with strong norms against anything that actually threatens group cohesion. Same-sex behavior between consenting adults wouldn't have threatened a group's hunting, its defense, or its ability to raise children. The people involved kept contributing exactly as they always had. There's no practical reason ancient communities would have spent energy suppressing it. And some good reasons, like social bonding and extra caregivers not competing for mates, they might have simply accommodated it. One more piece worth including, because it usually gets left out: the female side of this story. Female same-sex behavior among bonobos is actually more frequent and more central to their social life than the male version. And given how closely we're related to bonobos, that matters for thinking about our own evolutionary roots. The Venus figurines, those carved female forms found across Europe and Asia dating back 25 to 35,000 years, have been read by some researchers as connected to female embodiment and female relationships in ways we can't fully reconstruct. And the genetics tell the same story for women as for men. Common, widespread, ancient variants. Ancient women almost certainly experienced same-sex attraction at rates comparable to women today. So here's the honest summary. Ancient humans experienced same-sex attraction. That's about as certain as any behavioral fact about the ancient past can be. It was real, it was common, and it was as much a normal part of ancient human life as it is of modern human life. What varied, community to community, was how people understood it and acted on it. But the attraction itself was there, the same as it is now, part of the same inherited architecture that gave us language, art, and the drive to sit close to the people we love. It was always there. It always was.